I'm Bob at I Like to Make Stuff. Today we're going to use some cheap styrofoam to make a cartoon sword. Today's video is all about me trying out some things that I've wanted to try for a long time. Recently we made an accent wall at the office and we had to use a whole bunch of this pink insulation foam. The whole time I wished that I had a hot wire cutter. Well, I found one on Amazon for like 27, 28 bucks. But then I didn't have a project to use it on until I remembered that there's a show we like called Adventure Time, and there's a sword from that show that I've wanted to make for quite a while. So today we're going to use some foam and a hot wire cutter. We're going to make a sword. This is 1/2-inch insulation foam. You can get a 4x8 sheet of this for $15. It's a cheap way to make something. So we're going to use this, but because it's 1/2-inch, we need to stack up several pieces of it. So we're going to use some spray adhesive to connect all these and sandwich them into one big chunk, because this is the sword that I want to make. And it has kind of a diamond-shaped profile to it. It's got a big chunky crossguard and a chunky handle, so it needs to be kind of thick. So we're going to make this into a big block, and while we do that, we're going to put a dowel down the middle of it to make it strong. Okay, 35/8. That's what we're starting with. What is 1/8 of 7 inches? So 1/8 of 7 inches is 3/8 of an inch. I'm good, I'm getting there. All right, so the blade is 28 inches. That's not right because the entire thing was supposed to be 36. I like math, but I'm not gonna do it right now, so I'm gonna eyeball it.
A few moments later.
So Josh did the math for me, because he's awesome, and I was really, really close eyeballing it, which I'm just proud of. So the blade's gonna be about 22 inches long, the crossguard's 6 inches tall, the handle is 6 inches tall, and the little tooth thing at the end is 3 inches. First I'm gonna just kind of cut these pieces down to the general size and shape now that we know what that is, and I'm gonna do that with this. We're gonna save the hot wire cutter for when we actually do the details. I'm gonna use some Super 77. This is a spray adhesive, and this works great when you spray it on two surfaces, you let them dry, and then when you stick them together, they really, really stay together. So I'm gonna sandwich all these pieces, but right in the middle, we're gonna take this dowel and actually build it into the center of this thing so that when the sword is all finished, it has some sort of a rigid piece running down the middle. I'm gonna have to cut it a little bit short so it doesn't go all the way to the end, but I'm gonna cut this down, we'll make a little groove and lay it in here and then stack all these up. There is a plastic like this on, I think, both sides or maybe one side of all these pieces. And if it's out of the way, you'll have a better adhesion between the layers. I almost forgot that. Thanks, Josh. I started ripping off the plastic where all the lines were, which is not a big deal, but you know. Now they're even more approximate. I'm gonna put this dowel in here, but I have to make sure that I have a mark on each end as to where it is, because I'm not gonna be able to see it once it's in there and covered up. This video is sponsored by Micro Center. Now, if you're not familiar, Micro Center is a really cool store that you can go into and see all of the awesome maker electronics and gadgets and everything right up close. They've got entire aisles of Arduino and Raspberry Pi and all of the stuff you need to build an arcade machine, plus cameras and computer gear. In fact, they can help you build a custom PC in the store. They've got a great, knowledgeable crew of people working in their store. So if you're working on a project and you're kind of stuck, go in there and talk to them. They can help you out. They've also got an entire section of 3D printers, and these aren't just in the box. These are working printers that you can go up and watch, ask questions about. And if you're thinking about getting a 3D printer right now, they've got a fantastic deal. There's a coupon down in the description. If you print that out and take it into a store, you can get a Creality Ender 3 Pro for 99 bucks. This is a fantastic deal. It's an awesome way to get into 3D printing. They've also got filaments and everything else you're gonna need. So be sure to go check them out. And big thanks to Micro Center for sponsoring this video. We've got our blank all made up, and the shape of the sword will fit in this box, and we've got our dowel down the center. And so I'm going to take those center marks that I made and draw a line here on the top surface and then start to sketch out the sword around that to get the profile of it. Luckily, on Adventure Time, everything kind of changes shape from episode to episode, so I just have to get it close. It doesn't really have to be precise. I think that is the outline, and there's a lot going on here, but I think I know which pieces to keep and which ones to cut away. So we're gonna move over to the foam cutter. We're gonna try this thing out, and if this doesn't work, this whole project may be a bust. So here's hoping it does what it's supposed to do. The idea here, I think, is that this tip can come out, and so you've got different types of tips that you can put in the end of this, and the one I really care about here is actually this. And so what this is doing is heating up this really thin wire across here, and when you push it through the foam, it just melts the foam. It's not really cutting it, it's melting it out of the way. And so theoretically, you should have this entire shape that you can move through material, which means I am gonna have to cut away some of this extra stuff to get up to the shape that I want, because I've only got about that much throat. So we're gonna plug this thing in, let it warm up, and then do some tests on some scrap before we get to this. It doesn't quite move as fast as I expected. It does kind of drag through it. I don't want to break the wire, but I mean, totally worked. Super clean. Now this is a tool that you can make. There are many videos about making your own, so if you want one bigger, you know, for a very specific size, you could totally do it. This was just a cheap way to try one out, and I think it's gonna work. Ooh. Now, to get cutting on this, I don't have enough space here to actually get to the pieces that I need to cut. So I'm gonna take this to the bandsaw just to get rid of these big areas, and then we can work from there. I do think I'm gonna have to go a lot slower than I was expecting, given that I'm cutting through something this thick, but I don't know, we'll have to try it and see. Obviously you don't have to use a bandsaw, but it makes it a lot faster to do that. But the surface out here is very different than it is with the hot knife. And of course, I'm not gonna end up with a flat-sided thing. I'm gonna be adding a diamond-shaped bevel. So there's gonna be 4 sides cut at this, and I'm gonna have to use the hot knife tool to get that. So I'm trying to figure out exactly what the next steps are to cut the shape that I need to cut at the angles I need to cut. And I think I'm gonna start down here on this end where it's easier. The thing I was worried about with this, which now I understand doesn't make any sense, is that you would have the problem of a jigsaw. With a jigsaw, you have the blade attached at one end and the other end is kind of free floating. So as you cut through something, you get deflection and the blade goes out this at an angle. This is held at both ends, so it can't really do that, but I was worried that my hand would end up causing the same thing. And I'm sure you could do that, but it was really easy to get a nice vertical cut on this, and so I think this is actually gonna work really well for doing those bevels. Just realized that this one would actually be better for this because it's a rigid tip. And so it wouldn't flex and you wouldn't get that deflection that I've been kind of getting. Let's test it. Ooh. Not as clean, that's for sure. I do think I'm going to take this to the bandsaw and get right up to my lines so that when I cut the bevel, all I have to worry about is keeping the right angle. I don't have to worry about the amount of material and all that type of stuff. So I'm going to go back, trim this to the lines, and then I'll come back to the wire cutter. So those holes came out really well. I thought that was really cool. Next up, I got to figure out how to thin out all these different sections. And eventually I'm going to have to do the blade and add those bevels to it. And really that's going to set the overall thickness for everything else. But right now, I'm beginning to test how to shape all of the different parts, like the rounded handle. And just using a wood file actually works really, really well. Seems to be a nice finish on it, and this is all eventually going to get covered up and have a uniform surface to it anyway. This is a pretty good step. So, off camera, I'm going to spend some time getting this thing into shape, and then we'll cut the blade down. I've done some more shaping on the handle, and I've got it kind of round now. And there's a lot of voids in these areas, which ultimately don't really matter, but I am going to try to fill them in. I think I'm going to use wood putty, because eventually this whole thing is going to get covered with fiberglass. We're going to get to that in a little bit, but first, before we do any of the wood putty, we've got to cut down the blade. So I'm going to use the hot knife again to try to get a bevel on all four sides of this blade. Like I said earlier, it's kind of diamond shaped in profile. So I'm going to try to cut down it. Now, I'm going to do one, and if it doesn't quite work out like I want it to, I'll probably end up taking it to the bandsaw because it's a more controlled way to get a long straight cut. That worked out pretty well. None of the lines are smooth, but we're going to fix that with the file. But it did reveal a lot of voids that we have to fill. And instead of wood filler, like I said earlier, we're actually going to use spackling. It'll dry quicker, and I think it'll be fine for what I need to do here. This entire thing is going to get covered up with fiberglass, so that will smooth it out and give us a nice hard surface that we can put paint on top of. But before we can get to that, I've got to do some shaping, some filing, and spackling. Now we're going to try some fiberglass. The reason I'm doing this is to have a uniform hard surface on the outside of this that we can put paint on top of, and it's going to make it a little bit tougher than just the styrofoam would be. I've done this one time before, but I don't have much experience with it, so I'm going to be kind of figuring it out as I go along. But basically you take this fiber mesh, and you can get this in all different sizes, widths, shapes. You can get sheets of it, you can get stuff that you tear apart, a bunch of different options. And then you soak this in a fiberglass resin, then you lay it down on the thing that you're going to be fiberglassing. You want to make sure that you have several pieces of this and that they overlap and that you have plenty of resin. You want to squeeze out all of the air bubbles that you can, and then once you get one layer down and let it cure, you sand it a little bit and then add as many layers as you want. I'll probably only do 1 or 2 layers for this because it's really just a surface for paint. I figured there might actually be a problem putting the fiberglass on top of the styrofoam, so I did a test, and the fiberglass resin is a polyester resin, and it does this to styrofoam. So we decided to try epoxy resin, and it does this. It works great. And so we're going to use epoxy resin, which normally is not something you would use because it's a little bit more expensive, but in this particular case, with this material, it's going to work well. For this, we're going to use the high performance epoxy from Total Boat, and I've got a slow hardener, and so that will give us plenty of time to get it completely covered. We don't have to worry about it like flash hardening too quickly. So we're just going to mix up 1-to-1 ratio, dip the fiberglass sheets in it, and then kind of stick them on. I've got it hung here because it's a 3-dimensional object, and we want to be able to get an entire surface covered before the whole thing hardens. Otherwise, if it's laying on a table, we have to do half, wait for it to harden, and then flip it over and do the other half. As you can tell, I've never done this before. I know that this is not the ideal way to do it, but it seemed like hanging it would be a good thing to do. Now I'm second guessing that a little bit. All right, this is an entirely new process to me, and I'm not exactly sure how much resin to use, for a section of this fiber. And so I'm finding that the low spots here are not really grabbing the mat. It's coming loose, and so we've got these little air bubbles here. And if I try to add more resin to it, it doesn't really hold them down. So I'm not sure if maybe it's just not gonna be tight in all the spots and I'm gonna have to deal with that later. I don't know, I've never done this before. This is far more difficult than I was expecting. And I think part of it, well, it's all my fault, but part of it is my fault because I chose to hang this thing, which means it's moving around, it's trying to get away from me, I'm having to hold it still while I'm trying to push out the air bubbles. And so I think probably having a fixed object would be a lot easier to fiberglass. But also, I didn't coat the whole thing in resin first, which would make the mat stick to it better, I think. I also don't know how flat it's really supposed to be because once it cures, you do go back and trim it, sand it, and all that type of stuff. So maybe I'm not that far off, but it certainly feels like I am. I think what I'm gonna do is leave the mat on the blade, what I've got so far, and for the rest of this, I think I'm just gonna paint it with the resin, put a thin coat on it just to give it kind of a hard surface. The strength that I'm worried about is actually in this section. I don't really care so much about having a really reinforced surface everywhere else. So I think I'm just gonna paint this, let it all cure, and then do some sanding and see what it looks like. Here's where we're at on the sword. So I've got all the fiberglass finished, but honestly I just learned a whole bunch about how to do it next time. I'll get to that in just a second. After some sanding and some spot filler to fill in little voids, I put on a coat of some filler primer, sanded that again, and then put a base coat of just some rattle can red. We're gonna do a little more painting on top of this. But the fiberglass. I learned several things to do differently next time I do fiberglass. I don't think I did a good job on this one, but I definitely went to school on it. So first thing I learned is that you should definitely put down some resin on the surface before putting the mat on, the fibers on. They'll stay in place a little bit better, make it easier to paint on some more resin on top of that. So that is definitely the first step next time. But even in regards to the fibers themselves, I was using like a mat or a strip that I could cut down into pieces. And for something like this, I don't think that's the right play. I think the better thing would be to get loose fibers that you can tear and get little clumps of. That way you can push them into all the different little areas and voids and make them actually fit the object. I think the big panels and the strips would be better for something like a boat, a big flat surface that you're trying to work around. Of course, that's just me not having experience, and so now I know a little bit going into next time I do something like this. So far, I've learned a lot about fiberglass and using the foam cutter, and those were the points of this video, so really I just need to finish the sword up. To do that, I've got to do a little bit of paint, and it's really simple because I just need it to look like a cartoon. So we're going to change a couple of the faces to be a little bit lighter, a little bit darker, and add a highlight line up the edge. Then we're going to wrap the handle in leather and carve a little tiny tooth thing that sticks on the end here, and then this will be done. The red spray paint that I used as the undercoat here is super glossy. We don't really want that. So I've got some clear matte that I'm gonna spray on there. This is a acrylic matte finish spray. So we're just gonna put that on it to dull it down, let that dry, and then we're gonna wrap the handle with leather. Then this thing will finally be finished. Obviously, this is not what barge is supposed to look like. This is far more jelly less runny than it's supposed to be. I've got some thinner, but I'm not entirely sure that it's the right kind for this kind of barge, so I'm just trying to work without it. But ideally, this should spread a lot easier, and once it dries, you stick the two dried surfaces together and you have a really permanent bond. This thing is finished. Now, it's not like the ideal prop, but I am happy with being able to test out some new processes, a new tool, got to mess with a little bit of leather to do a wrap. That's pretty cool. And overall, it looks a lot like a cartoon, which was the entire point. So I hope you learned something from this video, maybe about one of the techniques, or just something I did that will inspire you to go make something that you like for yourself. And if it did, please let me know down in the comments. I'd appreciate it. We've got lots and lots of other types of videos that you may want to check out, and if you're not subscribed, be sure to do that as well. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Today's video is really just about exploring some things that I've wanted to explore for a while. So here's where we're at with the sword. We've got it pretty far along. It is red, and that's matte. Be matte. With this cartoon, the shape of the sword, if you squint, you can see it.